Bergholz. I'm here with my colleague, Maren Rojas. We're both from a company called Edgework Consulting, and really thrilled to spend some time with you all today. For each session, we're going to start with just a really short framing of how we think about this topic, and then we'll jump into the theme of the day. We really hope this series can serve as a moment for you to pause, to reflect, and to feel the power of this amazing element of your work and the care for young people in your lives. And to return, whether that's immediately, later today, or tomorrow, with a little extra energy, excitement, and a couple more tools in your toolbox. The caring adult relationship serves as the most protective factor in a child's resilience. This vital connection is something we all have the power to nurture and harness. It's the greatest skill set we can develop. And it doesn't require equipment, facilities, or curriculum. Though we can't always see the impact of love, we must believe that it matters. Each vital connection that we will explore is not just a young person's want. We think of it as a need. Wants imply something that you can say no to. A need is like water. You have to have it. Without it, you won't survive. And when we meet a young person's need, we do something vital for them. For each session, we'll share one story, talk briefly about how this particular vital connection ties into resilience, and then share some of our favorite kind of practical and exciting ways to forge this vital connection. So for the story, between 2009 and 2013, I had the privilege of working with Care International and Mercy Corps to help design and deliver an after-school program for 9 to 13-year-old Palestinian children in Gaza. At that time, just about 100% of parents and caregivers were reporting significant signs of stress and trauma in their children. Gaza is one of the most densely populated places on the planet. It's roughly 1.4 million people living in 145 square miles, and has been under kind of a chronic state of war, for better or for worse, and how you explain it, for the last 50 to 70 years, depending on kind of your politics. You couldn't go 3 blocks without seeing the visible damage of bombings and battles. The school systems were stretched to the breaking point. And our little after-school program was built around a couple of principles, but one of the kind of activities was these small teams of children that form very close bonds with each other and their mentor through a very simple activity that we ran at the end of each program called Team Time. On one particular day, I was observing a team and their mentor. Her name was Reem. She sat with them, about 5 children, for a discussion. It was several months into the program, so these kids knew each other very well. And Reem, she knew their stories, she knew their families. After settling into their circle, all sitting on very large plastic chairs made for grown-ups, 5 pairs of feet, swinging back and forth, not yet long enough to touch the ground, she asked, "What scares you?" And this is an intense and complicated question for any child, but particularly for children in this part of the world. There was a really long silence. Then a girl answered, "Walking home from school." She went on to explain that a building would get bombed or get knocked down because it wasn't livable anymore. And there would be never-ending amounts of construction happening to build and rebuild lots of parts of their neighborhoods. And so the routes home would constantly shift, and quite suddenly. And it was a truly scary and confusing experience to have to figure out new ways to get home every day. After another long pause, a boy then spoke, and he said, "Me too." Subsequently, all 5 of the children concurred that this was really scary and really hard for them. In the ensuing conversation, Reem sort of dove into the problem solving of this with these kids. And the results, their idea was that all 5 of them, and they happened to go to the same school, all facing this sort of particular challenge, which was not the challenge you'd think you'd hear when asking this population the question. You'd think you'd hear about day-to-day threats of bombings, economic hardship, electricity blackouts. They decided that this problem that was really pressing for them, they were going to solve by walking home to school, from school together. In fact, further, they agreed that they would adjust the order in which they would walk each other home so that no child would always be the last one on the route and have to walk home alone more than one day on their new rotational schedule. This was their story on this day about what was really hard for them, and they worked together to try to solve it.
So, love that story. It always makes me smile. I have heard it many times, but I still get a warm feeling in my heart. A story, when we're thinking about what it is, it can mean many, many things. I think when we're first building up this body of research, really looking into this, primarily we thought about story as being what the caring adult knows about the young person, what the young person reveals, all the little pieces and mysteries and things that you find out. That encompasses their story. And we think about it really and truly in layers, right? There's, I know your name. I actually know how to pronounce it correctly. I can high five you in the hallway. I can recognize you. But then there's those deeper layers. There's, I know who your caregivers are, maybe your siblings. Maybe I know on a deeper level how you're doing in school. And then we go into the deeper levels and layers and we think about their story being, well, what are your dreams and aspirations? And knowing those things, and even deeper, what fears and concerns do you have, like the young people in Reem's story? And all of this matters. And we think about this as our story about them, but there's a whole other element, and it's a huge element that we want to talk about today, and that's their story about themselves. Because I think truly, we know them in a certain way. We put these pieces of their lives together, but their narrative about themselves may be really different from how we view them or see them or experience them. I may think this young person is talented, special, going somewhere, has it all together. And this young person's story about themselves may be what they've heard all day long. I'm lazy. I'm not good. I'm not good enough. I'm not this. I'm not, and I can't. And you can fill in the blank. And this really matters for resilience, knowing someone's story, because even taking the time to know a small part of a young person's story, remembering their story, just even their name, for example, it matters. It's a recognition that they matter, that they deserve to be known, seen, and heard, maybe even loved and cared for. And that may not seem like a whole lot, but given how much children face these days, it can be. On the darker and deeper and more tragic side, children are facing abuse and neglect, being ignored, all the way to being bullied. And I think right now, there's many children, I think the research would support, that are just dealing with this epidemic of loneliness, great loneliness. And you knowing their story, knowing who they are, may be the most impactful part of their day. And here's the thing, you get to know their story, and you get to know their story themselves, you start to gain a really wide perspective. So that young person, maybe you're a teacher, and that young person who's that repeat offender, they're always tardy, they're absent a lot, right? The things that you start to believe about them from their behavior and observing them, hey, this person doesn't really care about academics, they don't really care about coming to the classroom, this isn't important, or even worse, this student is lazy. When you know their story and what's behind their narrative, maybe you find out that this young person is actually, they have a primary caregiver that has to work, and they're the person that has to get their younger siblings off to school and has to stay home with their younger sibling when their younger siblings are sick. This completely shifts our paradigm. As we get to know that, inevitably what happens is we are able to source their strengths. Instead of always looking at and picking apart their deficits, we start to really source their strengths. And further down the road, the more and more you get to know them, the best thing is you can start thinking about them not as their chronicle age dictates. So a 13-year-old should act this way, should behave this way, should cognitively and socially and emotionally be this way, but where they are developmentally. So we think about this as not thinking of them in their chronicle age, but as their developmental stage. And we can start meeting them where they need us to.
So what can we do? The first suggestion we'll offer today is re-meet your kids. And we mean this seriously. Take a step back and consider what you would ask and explore if you were meeting this young person or this group of young people for the first time this week or next week. Some of us work with the same populations for years. And with that comes a tremendous familiarity and depth of knowing And then there's pieces that we miss, there's biases and perspectives we bring that actually limit our ability to discover them in new and different ways. You don't have to formally interview them, although this could be fun. I had a project I worked on in Ethiopia where we had this one staff member who carried around this cardboard video camera and a big giant pretend microphone, and all day would just interview kids with nothing being filmed. It was all cardboard, and it was just magical. You know, the idea of being able to tell your story anew to someone that you already know. But what would it look like for the next week or the next month to refresh and bring new eyes, fresh eyes to their story? You know, to check your story to their story, to seek a renewed perspective on how they are doing, who they are, what they care about, what worries them. And if you've known someone for a really long time and you wonder about your own sort of lens and your biases and your judgments, find someone who is just getting to know them for the first time and see how they experience that young person as well.
Another example is what do the other 22 hours of their day look like? Really exploring that with them. That's another way we can really get to know their story more. We mentioned last week, I talked about a coach down in Philadelphia we did this workshop with, and he said, yeah, but what about the other 22 hours of the day when they're not with us and not in program? And here's the thing, we can make our bubble, our program, the four walls in which we meet these kids, the safest ever. But it doesn't matter if it's the safest ever, if it doesn't go with them out there. And we have to get to know, and exploring the other 22 hours of the day with them helps us to know what is happening out there. So what transferable things that we work on in here from the sports that we do, from the crafts that we design, from the after school activities, from the actual curriculum that we're doing in school, what can help them out there and not just progress academically, but what helps them navigate the streets, navigate their neighborhoods, navigate their relationships, both at home and with peers.
There's a evaluation tool that I learned about many years ago called MSC, which stands for most significant change. You can Google it. There's entire kind of manuals written about it. And it's always been one of my favorite tools to use for research. And essentially it involves asking each young person qualitatively, and this could be in writing, this could be in drawing, what's the most significant change that you've experienced since, and then you fill in the blank. Since last week, this year, since the program started. You can pick your timeline or your time frame. You can ask it more than once in the duration of a program experience. We can spend all the time in the world, I think, planning a program with great outcomes in mind. But what we need to really know is whether it's working and what is working. So you should invest in, I believe in pre and post surveys and randomized control trials, but I also think it's really key to ask regularly, what's had impact on you and what are you experiencing that is positive for you? And ask them regularly, what's working? How are they growing? And take their answer at face value. It's their story of what all the stuff that you're putting in, all these inputs and activities and hopes and aspirations, and what they tell you is the truth of your work, whether it's as an individual or as a group. And it also, what it does, I think, as a bonus outcome, is it creates the feedback loops that everybody desperately wants when you're the leader with other people, whether you're a manager or a boss with your team, or you're a leader of a situation you're working in with children, that they're able to tell you their experience of what's working. And if it's not what you planned for, it's still an outcome, and you get to look at it, and maybe it's wonderfully surprising and exciting. Maybe it's causes you to change the direction of your work, but it's incredibly rich feedback as well.
A few years back, this might have been 3 or 4, maybe even 5 years ago, Lou and I had the opportunity to listen in to a really great NPR podcast about a school out in the western part of the United States that was failing. It was a middle school. About 67 to 75% of their students would graduate into 9th grade. So there were repeats, and there were even dropouts at that point. And they decided, okay, for professional development week, we are going to flip the table. We're not going to be talking about curriculum and more education and academics. We are just going to do a relationship audit. So our next tool for your toolkit is to think about doing a relationship audit. And what this principal did was wrote every single kid's name down on a piece of paper, and in a list of questions going on those layers started with, I know their face and name. So I could put those two together. I know their caregivers. I know how they're doing in school. I know dreams and aspirations. I know maybe some fears or concerns. And it got deeper and deeper. And what they found with all the teachers putting their names next to students in each box, which they knew something about that student, is by and large, the students that were failing were not known. They had no relationship, no grounding, no touch points with a caring adult teacher in their lives. And their focus for the next school year was, we will get to know these kids that now have all these blank spaces. We're going to fill this out and we're going to invest in relationship. And they actually, their goal was for 2020 to turn their graduation rate around, but they actually hit it in about 2 years. They were be able to get into the upper 90 percentile just by focusing on relationship.
So the last example comes back to the story we shared earlier from Gaza, which is, think about taking the time, whether it's, if you have a formal kind of team time block that you work in, or just bringing your group of kids or even individual child together to talk about resilience and their stories about times when they succeeded despite the odds. And it's also great to talk about when they didn't succeed, but especially places where it was hard and they weren't sure it was going to work out, but it still did, and what they did to get there. It's wonderful when we share our inspiring stories and we have grown-ups come who can relate or are relatable, but in the end, for a young person to look inside their own experience and tell a story about themselves, that's something they can always take with them. And it may take a few tries to peel back enough levels of candor and openness, but I think one of the very best ways to leverage story, this theme we have for this week, and really get to know their story, is to invite them to talk about their experiences with successes and struggles, especially when those two come together. And again, it's always fascinating to find out what's hard for them, what makes their worry list, and where they've had, in their minds, some really important wins. And those are the wins that really deserve and need to be celebrated. And they aren't always the ones that get measured or graded in school or on a team. They're the things that someone needs to kind of track themselves, and the adults want to find out and discover. The process of becoming a skilled youth worker, whatever that means to you, always involves the study of child development. And this study is, in many ways, I think of it as a study of averages. It helps us determine really quickly what we can likely expect from a certain young person that we're working with at a certain stage or age of development, and Maren spoke about earlier. But I think it also becomes a barrier sometimes to the really wild and wonderful journey of getting to know this young person for who they are as an individual, and as a human, like as an individual human in their experience of the world. And I hope you can remember our friend Reem that we talked about earlier, and consider how you can pause your story about them and think about exploring how you can immerse yourself just a little bit more in their story of themselves. We hope the time was well spent today. This is part 2 of our 6-part series. Next week, we're going to explore the third vital connection, which we think of as belief. And we have some time now to open it up for questions in chats, and then we'll conclude. Thank you all for another chance to be together.
I wonder if you think of how grief, new grief, and old grief connects with this for kids.
So it's interesting. I think that there's a lot of emphasis placed on adversity and trauma, and this sort of, we know it's not linear, but this trajectory of kind of how you grow through it and how people move on and move forward. And I am not an expert in grief, and what I actually started off early in my career working with Paul Newman's organization with some of the camps that that company has built around the world for kids with life-threatening illnesses. And so got to, I would say, put a toe into kind of the bereavement and grief space. And it's different. And even more so in a way than sort of traditional kind of talk about trauma. I think it follows a very unique trajectory for each person, right? Some people, their grieving gets delayed out of survival and out of other choices, conscious or unconscious, for years and years and years and years. And grief is something, and loss, that people carry with them for a really long time, in very different forms and ways. And the language of like, I've overcome my grief, I'm not sure is really fair to use with anyone. And it's something I don't think we want to be putting on other people. We can make that choice for ourselves. And so I think of it as integration, right? It's an opportunity for to understand more about what a young person's going through, what grief means to them in terms of loss, in terms of what you miss, what feels lacking or empty, what feels consolidated, and that there's sense made out of it. And that part of that story, for many, many people, in fact, I would argue for most people on the planet, we're all grieving various things in our lives, right? For every age we get older, there's more loss that we experience versus maybe the newness. And so I'm not sure that's the answer to the question that you have, but I think appreciating and honoring that even very young people, and I think of very young being, old enough to have consciousness, which is in, you start to remember your own story, which is in that sort of 2 to 3, 2 to 4 year old range. There's things that can be real losses that have to be appreciated and acknowledged, and not just pushed to the side in the hope of sort of making things positive and let's move forward.
Pam asked a question here that I'll take a stab at first, Lou. She said, I was talking to my daughter, and she said her teacher meetings, kids were using stories, and that those stories were then being used to excuse behavior, like an actual lowering of expectations. I have to say that in my 20 plus years of coaching collegiate soccer and professional soccer, I think I was that person that I thought stories were brought up to excuse behavior. When I started doing this work, thinking more deeply and upending the stories, I think there's like a taking off of blinders almost to understand that we often, and this goes really back to this idea of developmental stage versus chronological age. We love the story of Mama P that's in Bruce Perry's book, The Boy is Raised as a Dog, where Mama P had a kid that had been fostered his whole life, and he was crying. He was 13 years old, but when he got really stressed, he would cry, misbehave, sometimes violently. He would crawl under, and he'd been through series and series and series of foster care after being removed from his abusive household. And his behavior started to change when he started work with Mama P, started being fostered by Mama P. And Bruce, as this really knowledgeable psychologist, had asked, what are you doing that's so different? We've noticed something different about him. And she says, well, when he acts like a baby, mind you, he's 13 years old, I treat him like one. Put his head in my lap, run my hands through his hair, I make calming noises, and I rub his back. And so she just met him at a developmental stage that he had clearly missed in his growing up years. That's more of an extreme story, but I do think that it upends our lens on kids are using these stories as excuses or crutches or ways of getting out of these things, and it's increasing our understanding and knowledge about them, where they're coming from, their context and narrative. And I do think it requires more of us. It's just deeper work to come from that lens and perspective. And Lou, I know you're going to have some thoughts on this, so I'll throw it to you if you want to answer more on that.
I mean, I think that there's I'm trying to really believe, and I don't always, but I try to, that whatever is a story or becomes an excuse or a reason to create a reaction from an adult that changes the expectations of a young person, that maybe that's brilliant, that this is this young person's way, without feeling humiliated, without saying I can't or I'm struggling or this is hard, that the adult might think of as being manipulative or them trying to kind of get out of something, that, yeah, they're trying to get out of something that's really hard for them and that they don't think they can handle. And as adults, the paradigm shift that we try to think about and when we do program design is every program that you do gets designed for some kind of average kid you're catering to. An average can, be within a very vulnerable population. And then there's going to be young people that the program's too hard for them. We say that they're not able to do the program. We put it on that young person and say they're not skillful enough, their behavior is not adequate enough. And in reality, we built a program that's just too hard for that kid. And when you put it on yourself, then you can really look in the mirror and say, okay, here's this kid that they want to be here. They're trying to kind of find a way to fit in, and we're saying no, when actually, however they're acting might be this brilliant form of communication that lets us know, hey, please don't kick me out. I'm trying to stay. I'm just telling you I can't do it the way you're asking me to. And it might not be as willful as we think. It might be, wonderfully skillful and really smart, but it's a very sophisticated and subtle kind of communication that we have to look for. And the truth is, a lot of programs aren't built for that conversation with a young person or that flexibility. And if my experience for most sort of mainstream-ish programs, if you're not sort of specifically working with a very kind of certain kind of population that might be affected by trauma, for example, then you're going to end up sending kids away. And the sad thing is, you're probably not the first program to do that. And they're looking to see if they fit. Just going to skim down here. Shelley, your question around the 22 hours of the day, we've indexed on that a little high the first two sessions because I think it's such an important thing to think about. Context is everything. If your program is a wonderful respite and a reprieve and a beautiful place to go, and it fortifies them for some aspect of their life outside of the program, I think that's the ultimate goal. But there are some places where a kid can get to and it can feel safe, but the moment they leave, they haven't transitioned well, and they're still holding on to this safety piece, and their mind hasn't gone back into what do I need to do to kind of navigate the next hour or half hour or next 22 hours. And so I think by itself, a program should have its own resilience impact, and at a minimum, be thinking about how do I make sure that each young person transitions out, having made the transition, and I don't just open the doors and say, good luck in this rest of your world, and we kind of distracted you for 2 hours, but haven't reminded you to make that kind of ease of transition, to actually pull the experience with you, let alone a skill or something else as well. Transitions for places where your work has that sanctuary kind of feeling, I think are so key to consider. And I'm coming down to, I think is it Judith?
I'm going to quickly, while you're scanning.
Yeah, go ahead.
Lou, I'm just going to respond. Ben, hi, how are you doing? What aspects of the relationship audit and focusing on building relationship do you think could or was measured or supported by those students' success? Was it just having the bond, someone believing in them, having someone who cared, witnessing them, affirmation, holding space for their success, or possibility of them doing well and having attunement, meeting needs that aren't elsewhere, other things, etc.? I'm going to say yes to all of this. This wasn't a measured study. What they were measuring was academic progress, and their focus was on relationship building. And all of those things were part of the relationship building. And I think all of them, I don't know, I couldn't actually honestly answer you whether one weighed in more than another, but I think the primary thing was this adult investing in this one kid's lives, the knowing their story, the seeing them, the acknowledging that they're there, the checking in with them, the affirming, all these things that you listed. So yes.
But I think within that too is very basic. Like, it's not just what you know about someone, but did you have an interaction with them in the last week? And you'll find there's certain kids like just nobody had any meaningful interaction with. And there's certain kids that certain adults will say, I don't even know who that kid is. They'll look at the name and go, no idea. And that's a beginning of where this starts to become really meaningful. Layla, your question in relation to Gaza and the oppressed communities, where have you noticed what may be more or less effective in regards to treatment of trauma-informed policies? When communities are affected, the community is the treatment, because they're not going anywhere, and they often they can't. And so the come in, we had a chance to work in Sandy Hook in the aftermath of the Newtown shooting at the elementary school there. And we were there for many years with a summer program for very young children. And it was amazing to see the level of support and service that dropped in and then flew out within sort of 2 years. And it's very challenging for communities to get all this expert advice and counsel and support and resource and then not have them. And so my experience in communities where the community is suffering is the community has to be sort of the core of the answer too, which is local NGOs, non-government organizations and community-based organizations, very local, and people that, everybody, it's amazing. Anywhere in the world you go where people are suffering, you can go to the most challenged place on the planet. There are people there suffering who are finding little bits of care for their neighbor who's also suffering. So activating that is really key. And for kids, we said this the first session, like it's all about the parents and caregivers, and being able to give them more support and love and skills is worth hundreds of hours of our direct service work with young people. And the same thing for youth workers, having them go on their healing journey and be a little bit ahead of the journey for where they're trying to hope that they can help their kids move through. This is where, as much as I love working with kids, if I can help a parent or a caregiver with something, that again, the amplification of that is dramatic. And so I think less is more in terms of what you put in intensely, and thinking about the little bits of places and people where the biggest impacts can happen. The best thing we did in Gaza, truthfully, is we only hired staff that live within 1.5 miles of each center we worked in. We did that on purpose so that they had to walk home and walk to the program. We knew it was close enough they wouldn't pay for a taxi. And we knew that the kids would follow them around the neighborhood. And they did. And these kids walked home with them. And the staff sort of had no choice but to kind of engage the kids for extra time. But then the kids would get to the front door of their house, and then parents would look out the window and say, please come up for tea. And you don't say no in that community to tea. And so then the youth workers, the mentors would walk into the homes and get an hour with the parents to just talk. It wasn't a formal training, but they knew, and they got paid for that time. They got paid for the walk home, because we knew they were going to spend time in the home. And we were doing all these amazing kind of secret home visits, but really enlisting, connecting with, supporting, and educating parents and caregivers and whole family systems on the heels of one child that said, come in for tea. So there's some really amazing things you can do when you can get a little bit closer to what life is like, kind of block by block, and not just where your program space is. I know we're over time here. We are going to keep tracking our questions that we don't get to, and Maren and I are going to kind of give some responses offline, and by the end of the series, we'll try to pull together a document that doesn't leave any question hanging, but I know we're leaving a few hanging today, and we apologize for that. With that, I guess we'll say thank you, and enjoy the rest of your morning, evening, or afternoon, wherever you are in the world, and we're really excited to see you all next week.